Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's live stream broadcast from the City of Forest Grove Library. We are very fortunate to have with us tonight Walidah Imarisha, who is going to be talking about why there aren't more Black people in Oregon. This is her hidden history presentation. My name is Bob Abbey. I'm an adult services librarian for the City of Forest Grove, and I also coordinate all of our adult programming, both in person and more recently virtually. I want to welcome everyone who is joining us tonight on Facebook and on our YouTube channel. And while folks are finding their seats virtually, want to take a little time to have you share the following in the comments section of whichever platform you're using, either Facebook or YouTube. Tell us where you are tonight and what you're hoping to learn from the content of tonight's program. So we'll let folks stream in here a little bit and give you an opportunity to share those comments with us. I know we have folks viewing from not only our immediate vicinity, but also from around the state of Oregon, so it would be great to know where you're from. I do want to remind you that we will make this video available on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. You can access this starting tomorrow, so please feel free to revisit this and share with anyone you think would be interested in watching. This is going to be a great program. We're really excited about being able to share this with you. So please let folks know about that, and we will have that available starting tomorrow. So again, if you're just joining us, if you could take a moment to share your location with us and also what you're hoping to learn tonight. So we've got folks joining us from Portland, Gaston, Hillsboro, Forest Grove, Milwaukee. Another viewer from Portland. Welcome, everyone. Eugene. This is great. So we'll keep this up, and LeGrand, welcome from LeGrand. Another viewer from Forest Grove, welcome. Medford, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Hello, Grand Rapids. McMinnville, Beaverton, great. This is wonderful. We love seeing this. Before we get started, just a couple of little housekeeping items. I want to make sure to thank the Multicultural Center at Pacific University as well, and also the Friends of the Forest Grove City Library for their very generous financial support to make this program possible. Libraries are looking far and wide to develop partnerships during this period when we're closed to the public, and we've been very fortunate to have a number of community partners who have helped us make programs like this available to you. So thank you to Pacific University, thank you to the Student Multicultural Center, and also thank you to the Friends of the Forest Grove City Library. So again, if you're just joining us, please take a moment to jot down your location in the comment section and let us know what you're hoping to learn tonight. So we are very pleased to welcome Walidah Imarisha tonight. Walidah is an educator, a writer, an activist, a public scholar, and a poet. She's the co-editor of two anthologies, including Octavia's Brood, science fiction stories from social justice movements, as well as the author of Angels with Dirty Faces, 3 stories of crime, prison, and redemption, which won a 2017 Oregon Book Award for creative nonfiction, and the poetry collection called Scar Stars. She spent 6 years with Oregon Humanities Conversation Project, facilitating programs around the state dealing with such topics as Oregon Black history, alternatives to incarceration, and the history of hip hop. She was one of the founders and first editors of the political hip hop magazine AWOL. She's taught at Stanford University, Pacific Northwest College of the Arts, Oregon State University, and Portland State, where she directs the Center for Black Studies. I'm going to bring Walidah into the stream. Good evening, Walidah. Welcome.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I am going to step outside of the stream. If you want to go ahead and share your screen with us again, and I'll be back at the end for our Q&A session.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Bob.
All right. All right. Take care.
And I just want to say thanks to the Forest Grove Library for inviting me, as well as the Pacific University Multicultural Center and the Friends of Forest Grove Library for making this space possible. I love libraries. They're amazing, and we need them more than ever right now in these times. So I'm excited to be here. The outline for this evening is I'm going to share a short presentation I've created around Oregon Black history, and then I'm going to leave a bunch of time for question and answer. I'm going to do sort of a historical overview using the Oregon Black History Timeline, which is a tool that I created to allow us to have conversations about the history of race, identity, and power here in the Northwest, as well as the larger nation. So it's a tool that I made to help facilitate these conversations. So I'll show you some key moments in history. I'm going to sort of do an overview and then leave lots of space. So if there are specific areas y'all want to talk about more, you can post that in the comments and we can dig in deeper. So I do want to just be very clear. If you were not clear from the title of this program, Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon, A Hidden History? This focus is on Oregon Black history. That's my area of scholarship. I will obviously talk about the larger forces of white supremacy that have shaped all communities of color here. But it's incredibly important to learn those individual histories of different communities of color and to not generalize. Our experiences have been varied, even though they have come from the same source and the same white supremacist ideology. And even more importantly, our resistance has been varied as well as intertwined. So it is important to learn those individual histories as well as the collective histories of folks of color's oppression and resistance here in the Northwest. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. And I wanted to start by providing you with this link to a version of the timeline that I created. So it's on YouTube. So if you just look up Oregon Black History Timeline, either on YouTube or Google, this will be the first thing that comes up. And it is a longer version than we are going to be going through tonight. So there's even more information. So you have access to almost all of the information I'm presenting tonight, as well as more. So that there is that YouTube video, and then there's a second option. So you can actually get a PDF excerpt of it that was printed a long time ago now in 2013 in Oregon Humanities Magazine. So if you just Google Hidden History, Oregon Humanities Magazine, it'll be the first thing that comes up. And then you'll see a page that looks like this. There's a short article I wrote about doing this work way back in 2013, and I'm happy to talk about what has and has not changed. And then if you scroll down, there's actually also an interactive timeline that you can engage with. So those are the two different ways that you can access this information I'm going to be sharing tonight. And I think Bob is, as a wonderful true librarian, is going to be dropping those links in the chat so you can have access to them. So first, I want to start at the beginning. So I've met many white people in Oregon who are very proud that Oregon came into the Union as a free state. And while it is true that Oregon, while it was still part of the Oregon Territory, outlawed slavery, I would never call it a free state or a free territory, because at the same time that it outlawed slavery in 1844, it also outlawed Black people. that 1844 provision outlawed Black folks from existing through the first Black exclusion law. And that also included the lash law that said that Black people would be publicly whipped up to 39 lashes every 6 months until we left the territory. That was the first of 3 Black exclusion laws that were reinforced throughout Oregon's history. And it is incredibly important to recognize that this brutal law and the ones that subsequently followed were about the larger ideology that the white colonizers had for the Northwest, which was to build a racist white utopia. And that is actually very clear from their own words. So Peter Burnett, who was an influential legislator, it was actually called Peter Burnett's Lash Law. He went on to become governor of California. He said that the object of the Lash Law was to keep clear of that most troublesome class of population, Black people. We are in a new world under the most favorable circumstances, and we wish to avoid most of those evils that have so much afflicted the United States and other countries. So from its inception, those white people who colonized and settled the Northwest were very clear that their purpose was about keeping out Black people as well as other folks of color, because the goal was to build an ideal white utopia, which is in and of itself a racist idea. If you're creating a utopia that's only for one race of people, that's a racist utopia. And it's incredibly important to recognize that the Oregon Territory was not just Oregon, the state. It was Oregon, Washington, Idaho, parts of Wyoming, and parts of Montana. So when you said the Oregon Territory, you said the entire Northwest. So the foundations of the entire Northwest was as a racist white utopia. Pardon me. Sorry, I'm just, we had this before, and now for some reason, I'm going to just stop my screen share and then start again. It's always the best way to do things. There we go. So this concept of a racist white utopia can be seen through many, many other laws and provisions that were passed in this early period. Another one was the 1850 Oregon Donation Land Act that gave away land for free only to white people to literally build this racist white utopia upon. And at the end of the day, 2.5 million acres of indigenous land was stolen from indigenous communities and given away, again, for free to white people to build this place that we all live. And that is also part of the founding ideology of creating a racist white utopia. That ideology of creating a racist white utopia resulted in Oregon being the only state admitted to the Union with a racial exclusionary clause in its constitution. Oregon's constitution included the third Black exclusion law that banned Black people from living in Oregon, from holding real estate, from making contracts. There are many things that are important about this. One of the most important pieces I want to point out is that that language was actually not voted to be removed from the Constitution until 2001, and it wasn't actually removed from the Constitution until 2002. So well into the 21st century, Oregon's Constitution included this Black exclusion language. And this was not an oversight, because the Black community came to white Oregon again and again for almost 80 years and said, please remove this language and show this is not the kind of place that you want to be. And again, by refusing to remove that language, white people in Oregon said, this is exactly the kind of place we want to be. And for anyone who was here in 2001, you remember it was a fight to get that language removed in the 21st century. There was immense pushback. It went to the ballot measure, and almost 30% of Oregonians voted to leave the Black exclusion language in the Constitution. The biggest sort of justification for this was wanting to preserve Oregon's history, which many heard as wanting to preserve this sort of ideology of a racist white utopia. So that is absolutely the foundation of this place that we are. It is also, however, the foundation of every state in the Union and this nation as a whole, because this idea of a racist white utopia is the same idea of manifest destiny that founded the colonization of the United States. And the concept behind manifest destiny is literally said by white colonizers that God gave this land to white people to make productive because indigenous people were not using it properly. And therefore they had a God-given right to do whatever was necessary, including the theft of entire continents, chattel slavery, genocide, to make it prosper. And that is the founding ideology of our nation, which is reflected in the notions here in the Northwest. And I just in this slide included this quote from a sitting US senator that said at the very beginning of the 20th century, he said this quote, "God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years for nothing but vain and idle self-admiration. No. He has made us the master organizers of the world to establish system where chaos reigns. He has made us adept in government, that we may administer government among savages. Were it not for such a force as this, the world would relapse into barbarism and night." So that is, in essence, the exact same ideology and justification that we heard from Peter Burnett, the idea that here was a God-given chance to create the sort of perfect world that had to be done in spite of people of color by white people, and in terms of the Northwest, in the exclusion of people of color. But I always want to be clear and always root in not only the oppression, but the resistance. There has never been a moment of repression where there was not active and organized resistance. And I want to be very, very clear, and if you walk away with nothing else, to root in the knowledge that communities of color in general and the Black community specifically have never been passive victims. They have always been active change makers. And we see this continually through this entire timeline. And so I'll be raising up some instances that allow you to see that. And we'll start here in 1867, which was a huge year for access to public education, both in Portland as well as in Salem, Oregon. So in both Portland and Salem, Black children were locked out of public education. They were not allowed to attend schools. There was no place to educate them and other students of color. And so Portland and Salem Black communities took different tactics. Portland went the route of threatening a lawsuit, and the Portland Public Schools, PPS, reluctantly opened up a school to serve Black children. In Salem, the Black community themselves raised $427.50, which was an immense amount of money in 1867, especially for people who had no legal standing at that time. And they started their own school to educate their children, as well as putting pressure on Salem School District to take over the financial cost of running that, which they eventually did. And this opened up public education to Black students, as well as to other folks who had been locked out of mainstream public education. And this is a really important point when we talk about organizing and resistance and change. We see that when Black communities organize, they create institutions that make the entire community safer, healthier, and more whole, and provide access for those who had been locked out of it before, if not fundamentally reimagining the institutions that they're engaging with. So we get to see the first large influx of Black folks, which is relative, coming in the 1880s with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. We also see a shift of folks, Black folks in Oregon, shifting more to Portland with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. But that is also, to be clear, there have always been Black folks all over Oregon, and I'll show you instances of those, and continue to be to this very day. But this is a significant period because we see the Black population in Oregon double up to 1,186, which is not a huge number, but it does mean that there are significant numbers of folks, that there are communities that form, that businesses form, that cultural organizations form to support one another in Portland as well as in different places across the state. So this is a very big time period for Black people in Oregon, but it also leads to backlash from white communities who utilized a variety of tactics that are rooted in that idea of a racist white utopia. And one of them is lynching. And so we can absolutely talk more about lynching as a tool of white supremacist violence. But I wanted to raise up the instance in 1902 of Alonzo Tucker, who was a Black man in Coos Bay. He had come up to work in the mines. Black folks were actually actively recruited to work in the mines in and around Coos Bay in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But Alonzo Tucker had transitioned into being a small business owner as well as having a number of different jobs. He was accused of assaulting a white woman, despite white eyewitnesses at the time who contradicted that. A mob formed to attack Tucker. They brutalized him, shot him, tortured him, and finally, in front of 300 people, they hung him off a bridge in broad daylight and left his body there for hours. This was absolutely sanctioned by the U.S. Marshal in terms of being there and being complicit. The U.S. Marshal was present and did not stop this from happening. In fact, Alonzo Tucker was still alive in the hands of the mob, and the U.S. Marshal left him there and just left. Also complicit was media. So newspapers across the state of Oregon described the lynch mob as quiet and orderly. They described Alonzo as a Black fiend who got the death he so thoroughly deserved. And despite this happening in broad daylight in front of hundreds of people, no one was ever held accountable for Alonzo Tucker's murder. But in the context, again, of recognizing that repression breeds resistance, there's still resistance happening today. And so there's an amazing organization called the Oregon Remembrance Project, led by Taylor Stewart, who has worked to memorialize Tucker and is working with the city of Coos Bay and the Coos Bay Historical Museum to go through a process laid out by the Equal Justice Initiative. And so the first stage was soil collection, and that's what the picture was from, collecting soil from the site of his murder. And one of them will go off to the National Lynching Museum, and one will stay on display in Coos Bay. So even well over 100 years later, folks are still trying to figure out, what does justice look like for Alonzo Tucker, for that community, for Black people in Oregon through this act. Another method of social control, and there are many of the Black community, was around controlling where Black people could live. So specifically looking at Portland and seeing the notion of segregation, of redlining. The concept of redlining is literally drawing a red line around a small area on the map, usually the least desirable part of the city, and saying within those lines are the only place that Black folks are allowed, and sometimes other folks of color are allowed to rent or buy. Usually through loans from banks, but it's a coming together of many different forces, including ones like the Portland Realty Board, whose code of ethics in 1919 mandated that real estate agents were not allowed to sell to people whose race was determined to lower the property values in that neighborhood. And then that was later changed to expressly say Black and Asian people. And so we see this concept of controlling and constraining Black communities physically, as well as through the threat of violence, are just two mechanisms of white supremacist control of Black populations. And this is why in Portland, the heart of the Black community, well, this is why in Portland, the majority of Black people have historically lived in the Albina neighborhood, which is what is inside the red lines that are in this picture. But what made it the heart of the Black community is the resistance, the organizing, and the community building of Black people. So we can talk a lot more about segregation and the sort of control of space if folks are interested in doing that, using Portland as an example. So there are a lot of myths about race that we tell in this nation, and the Ku Klux Klan is an example, I think, of a lot of different myths coming together. So the way that we talk about the Ku Klux Klan is that they were a fringe organization that only operated in the South, that was the membership of which was made up of mostly not formally educated working class white men, and that this is an organization that died out in the 70s. None of that is true. All of that is false. And we in Oregon were believed to have had the highest per capita Klan membership in the country at a time where Black communities, other communities of color, Jewish communities, Catholic communities were small because they were brutally kept so. That Klan membership was, amongst other things, about, again, sending a message about the kind of place that folks wanted to live. But again, Oregon is a useful case study for the rest of the nation because nationally, 15% of eligible Americans were card-carrying members of the Ku Klux Klan. So across this country, 15% of white men, because that's all they wanted, were card-carrying members of the Klan. So their numbers were immense, nationally as well as in Oregon. They also reached in the highest echelons of power, as you can see in this picture, posted in a newspaper here, and it shows Portland police chief, district attorney, U.S. attorney, the Multnomah County sheriff, and the Portland mayor posing with hooded Klansmen under a headline saying that they are taking guidance from what the Klan would like to see happen in Portland. So again, clearly the Klan reaching into the highest echelons of power here in Portland. And that is true statewide as well. In 1922, the Klan helped to elect its own governor, Walter Pierce, who worked hand in hand with the Klan to pass many pieces of legislation to further their white supremacist agenda. Things like the Compulsory Education Act, which eliminated private schools, mandating every child had to attend public schools to give them access to students, as well as to attack Catholic private schools. They also passed literacy tests, which we think of as racist tools to suppress voting in the South, but we had them here in Oregon, thanks to Walter Pierce and the Klan. But again, even though the Klan had broad reach across this state, Oregon is a useful case study for the rest of the nation because the same thing was happening nationally. So around this time, we had Woodrow Wilson as president. Woodrow Wilson was a huge supporter of the Ku Klux Klan. He wrote a pro-Klan history book, which became the basis for the novel The Klansman, which was the basis for the film Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is perhaps the most virulently racist film that's ever been created. It glorifies the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. It portrays Black people as little more than animals that need to be controlled to protect white communities and especially white women. Birth of a Nation was also the first film that ever screened in the White House, and Woodrow Wilson would show it to visiting dignitaries as if it were a documentary. And so again, the Klan was not an organization that sat on the fringes of American society. It sat at the heart of American society. Its framework was not in conflict with the American ideology. It worked hand in hand and was in fact intertwined. And again, resistance was always present. So even in the face of this incredibly brutal terrorist organization, Black communities organized across this nation, and including here in Portland. So the Portland chapter of the NAACP and other Black leaders worked to ban the screening of Birth of a Nation because back in those days, films would screen in theaters over and over and over again because there weren't very many films. Every time Birth of a Nation screened year after year, white mobs would go out across this nation in cities and attack Black communities. And so the national NAACP organized to ban Birth of a Nation, and the Portland chapter was part of that effort. And they were successful actually in getting first city council to ban the showing of any film which would stir up hatred between the races, and then specifically banning the film Birth of a Nation by name. So that's one form of resistance, but there are many other forms. And I think it's important to note one of the biggest forms of resistance for Black communities was existing, because we were never supposed to be here. And so the fact that Black communities exist in Oregon at all is incredible, because Black people heard they would be publicly tortured over and over again until they left. And they said, well, I'm not staying. And they paved the way for other Black folks to be here, and not just in Portland, but across the state. And so I always like to raise up the example of Maxville, which was founded in 1923. 60 skilled Black workers were recruited to come with their families to work in the lumber town of Maxville in Wallowa County in Eastern Oregon. And they built a community out there amongst the trees and lived there until the lumber company shut it down. And again, the idea of connecting this history to the present, Gwen Trice, who is actually the daughter of one of the original loggers, has done incredible work to preserve this history. She started the Maxville Heritage Interpretive Center, where you can go and learn more about this history. She actually made the documentary, The Logger's Daughter, which the last time I checked was available to watch on OPB for free. It's a short documentary. And she's actually working to buy the land where Maxville was and to recreate the town itself, to rebuild it so that folks can literally step into this Black history that existed in Eastern Oregon. And I believe she's launching a public fundraising campaign to support those efforts. So if you are interested, you should look up the Maxville Heritage Interpretive Center and check out Gwen Trice's work around that. Another form of resistance is cultural. And so Portland was seen as a jazz treasure nationally from as early as the 1930s. And, all the jazz greats played in Portland. North Williams Avenue was the heart of Albina, which again is the Black community in Portland. And you could hear jazz 24 hours a day on North Williams Avenue. And this is incredible because Portland was considered to be the most segregated city north of the Mason-Dixon line. So the most segregated city outside of the South. Folks have referred to the racial segregation in Portland as apartheid. And so it cannot be overstated how brutal white supremacist segregation was here in Portland, and how much that legacy is still it's a living legacy, and it's very much with us. And even in that space where Albina was overexploited and under-resourced, the Black community created this culture of resistance that folks nationally recognized and respected. And it's important to see that as a significant space of resistance. So the second large influx of Black folks came during World War II. And across this nation in the North, workers from the South were being recruited, all races, but especially Black workers were being recruited to come work in the northern wartime industries. In the Portland area, that was the Kaiser shipyards. And so Kaiser was actively recruiting in the South. Much of the messaging that went out, especially to Black people, was get away from the terror of racist lynching in the South and come to the North and build the sort of society and life that you have hoped for your children, which of course, knowing again that Portland is the most segregated city outside of the Mason-Dixon, north of the Mason-Dixon line, has its own brutal history, is a horrific thing for Black folks to come here and to be confronted with that. But there was nowhere to house those workers. Portland was very clear that it did not want them. In fact, the Portland mayor said in the newspaper that we have enough Negroes and we don't need any more. And so Kaiser bought unincorporated land between Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon, and built Vanport, which became the second largest city in Oregon. He turned it over to the Housing Authority of Portland to run. And at its height, it was 40% Black. And so this marks a huge shift in the demographics of Oregon and of the region. But they never intended for Vanport to be a permanent city. And even before the end of World War II, the Housing Authority of Portland had plans to demolish Vanport and other wartime housing projects. They wanted those people gone as soon as the war ended. But it was because of the organizing work of Black people and other folks in Vanport that did not happen when the war ended in 1945. There was a number of organizations organizing. One of them was the Vanport Tenants League. The two main things they were organizing around was housing and police violence in the 1940s. So that is huge to recognize that those issues are still very much some of the top issues for the Black community now, 80 years later. But the Housing Authority of Portland did get what it wanted because in 1948, the Columbia River flooded. Vanport was not properly protected for that. And it was built with surplus war material. It was never supposed to be permanent. So houses just floated away. It was pretty much completely destroyed. And this is when we see the demographics changing for Portland. We see a lot of the Black folks who remained in Vanport moving into Portland. We see the lines, those red lines expanding around where Black folks could live. And we see this really being the first time there's a large enough Black population that the city of Portland has to at least pretend to listen to the needs of the Black community. So I'm not going to go completely and super in depth into everything around housing and sort of the progression of urban renewal to urban neglect to gentrification. But I would strongly encourage everyone to read Dr. Karen Gibson's piece, Bleeding Albina, A History of Community Disinvestment. It is the foundational document to understanding those forces, both in Albina, but also in every major city across this country. And I'll just pull out, there's so many brilliant things that Dr. Gibson says in this piece, but I'll just pull out that she is very clear that if you are not looking to the 1940s and 50s as sort of the beginning of this pattern of urban renewal and housing crisis and the foundations of gentrification, then you can't begin to understand gentrification if you're only starting to talk about it in the 1990s, which is when most folks do talk about it. And the other piece that she says that I think is incredibly important is that she highlights that gentrification is structural, it is intentional, it is multi-decade, and it is a collaboration between private and public interests. And I think all of those framings are really important. So I would just encourage everyone to read Dr. Karen Gibson's Bleeding Albina, which you can find for free online as a PDF. If you just Google Bleeding Albina, it'll be the first thing that comes up. But that first wave of urban renewal that she talks about starts in the 1950s, both here in Portland and across this nation. And so again, after Vanport flooded, Black folks were redlined into the Albina neighborhood. 4 out of 5 Black folks lived in Albina. Again, it was a thriving community that was, working to just support one another and build self-determination and power. The heart of that community was demolished when voters approved the construction of the Memorial Coliseum, which is where the Moda Center is now. So if you've ever gone to see the Blazers play, that used to be the heart of the Black community. It cut North Williams Avenue in half. It destroyed hundreds of homes. The same year, federal funding was received to put in the highways, again, not only here in Portland, but across the nation. And those, again, went on top of Albina here and other places, working class Black and brown communities. And so we see that community destabilized and displaced and pushed upward to Upper Albina. But again, folks were still organizing throughout all of this period. And so I definitely wanted to raise up the example of the Portland chapter of the Black Panther Party. And I teach a class on the Black Panther Party, so I am going to stay focused and not talk about this for 20 minutes. But the Black Panther Party was actually an international organization. At its height, it had 50 chapters across the US. Oregon actually had 2 chapters, one in Eugene and one in Portland. The only program that every chapter of the Black Panther Party was mandated to have was a free breakfast for children program. And so at its height, the Black Panther Party fed tens of thousands of children for free every day across this country. And they fed children of all colors, and as well as other folks. It's not like they did not. They also allowed parents to eat if they needed to. And in fact, the reason we have free and reduced lunch programs is because of the Black Panther Party, because the Black Panther Party basically shamed the federal government into creating that program, because the Panthers fed so many children with no federal funding, with no grant funding, just through donations of resources, time, and energy. Another program that most Black Panther Party chapters had was a free healthcare clinic. And again, it was open to everyone. The only question they asked when you came in was, what's wrong with you and how do we support you? Portland actually had 2 healthcare clinics. One was a general clinic and one was a dental clinic. That dental clinic actually was taken over by Oregon Health Sciences University, OHSU, and is still running to this day. So because of the Black Panther Party, that community has had under the Panthers free dental care and under OHSU low-income dental care for 50 years. And this example to me is so important because, like the 1867 Salem community forming their own school to educate their children, it shows that when Black leadership, Black vision is centered, it makes the entire community healthier and more whole. And so that is an incredible example of that. I'm going to just move really quickly to just kind of bring us a little closer to today. But again, if folks want to talk more about this, we can definitely delve in. But there was a second blow to the Black community after they had been displaced from Lower Albina. They've been displaced to Upper Albina, which includes the area around Emmanuel Hospital. Emmanuel Hospital partnered with the city of Portland to, through their own admission, to lie to the federal government, to steal people's homes, and ended up demolishing over 1,100 housing units. The idea was to build an expansion for Emmanuel Hospital. They applied for federal funding, the city of Portland and Emmanuel Hospital together to get that. But they were denied that federal funding, partially because of what they had done to the Black community. So they started demolition before they were approved for funding. So they demolished over 1,100 housing units, and then were told they did not have the funding to build the expansion to the hospital. And that community was allowed to stay like that for decades. And again, it was not because of a lack of the Black community coming forward. The Black community came again and again to Emmanuel Hospital, to the city of Portland for decades, and said, give us this land that you are not using and let us build community centers, gardens, affordable housing, parks, anything. And again, the city of Portland Emmanuel Hospital allowed that land to stay vacant, which destabilized and devalued that neighborhood, which Dr. Gibson talks about is actually part of the process of gentrification. So you end up in the 1980s in Portland, but also across this nation, with property values falling to half or less of their original value. At the same time, rampant unemployment is happening. There's the plan of benign neglect to cut off public services to communities of color across this nation, and Albina was part of that as well. So we see all of these forces coming together that, again, completely devalue that neighborhood to make it ripe for gentrification, for other folks to come in and to buy up that neighborhood and to basically remove the original population from it. Part of that process of gentrification, and to be clear, gentrification is a violent process. It is never a good process. It is the replacement of working class, usually Black and brown communities, with wealthier, whiter communities. There's not money coming in that is for the people who exist there that can support them in revitalizing their own community. It's only after they're being pushed out that resources come in to revitalize it for a different community that is wealthier and whiter. And so part of that process is the utilization of policing, of criminalization and incarceration of the existing populations. And we see that happening in the 80s across this nation. And one horrific example of that was the murder of Lloyd Tony Stevenson. Tony Stevenson was a Black man who came across a robbery that was happening at 7-Eleven in 1985, and he stopped the robbery from happening. When police showed up, they immediately put him in a sleeper hold, even though the clerk was saying that's not the guy, and they choked him to death. The other horrific part about this is that there was immense backlash from that was not the horrific part. There was immense backlash from the Black community about this, and organizing and outrage and protest, similar to what happened in the 2014 murder of Eric Garner, who was choked to death by a New York police officer. Eric Garner said, "I can't breathe," 11 times. And so in response to that, the Portland police, on the day of Tony Stevenson's funeral, printed up T-shirts and wore them that had a smoking gun and the phrase that said, "Don't choke 'em, smoke 'em," implying don't use the chokehold, just shoot unarmed Black people. The Black community again protested in outrage. The officers who created the T-shirts were fired and then reinstated. The police officers who murdered Tony Lloyd Stevenson were cleared of all wrongdoing. And so this is just one example of the ways that the over-policing of the Black community during this period and the framework of Black criminalization led to horrific results as it continues to do so. I also wanted to just include the murder of Mulgiga Syrah. To be clear, we're seeing a huge uptick and have been for a significant period of time of street-level white supremacist violence by white supremacist fascist groups here in Portland, in Oregon, as well as nationally. Again, just like police violence, this is not something that is new. So in 1988, Mulgiga Syrah was murdered. He was beaten with a bat in the street by racist skinheads. And it was horrific. And again, there was immense outrage and organizing that happened. And folks are still doing work lifting up this case and making sure it's not forgotten. I know Michael Crenshaw recently did a podcast about the Mulgiga Syrah murder just this year and talking about the lessons, the similarities that need to be taken from that for this specific time period. And lastly, this leads us to the 1990s, which is when folks see gentrification happening. And so again, there's so much to say about gentrification, but it's incredibly important, as Dr. Gibson said, to see that this is where we see the sprouts coming up through the dirt, but it had been growing underneath the soil for decades, as we saw very quickly over the different decades. And it was an intentional and structural issue, that it was not something that just happened naturally. It is something that was planted and watered, and is something that is still happening. And it's important to note, people talk about gentrification and the displacement of the Black community now from North and Northeast Portland. And one of the things that's different about this time, because the Black community has been displaced again and again, as we saw, is that folks are being displaced in multiple directions. So they're being displaced out towards East Portland, out of Portland into Gresham and other places, also being displaced north out of Portland entirely into Vancouver, Washington, into a different state, but they're also being displaced into prisons. And it's incredibly important to me that if we are not talking about Black folks who have been incarcerated, then we're actually not talking about the entire Black community. And again, the over-policing and the criminalization and the incarceration of Black communities is part of how gentrification functions. And so it is not a coincidence that Measure 11, which was a mandatory minimum, passed in 1994 at this period when all of this gentrification is happening. Measure 11 is responsible for the vast amount of the growth of Oregon's prison population, which disproportionately affects Black communities. It removed judges' discretion in sentencing. It set times for specific crimes. And so there was no ability for the judge to say, well, there's extenuating circumstances. It set very high set times for specific crimes. And it also mandated that any youth being over 15 being charged with a mandatory minimum be tried as adults. And so this is an incredibly important piece of that history. And we need to not see this as there's the issue of gentrification and the issue of police violence and incarceration. We need to see the ways that they are intertwined and work together hand in hand. And what we end up with, specifically here in Portland, is a situation like this, which this is a report released by the Portland Housing Bureau, the State of Housing in Portland report, which came out at the end of 2019. You can go online and read the entire report. But I pull out this graph to show that Portland is obviously incredibly unaffordable for the vast majority of people and communities. But specifically, if you are Black, if you are Latinx, if you are Indigenous, if you are Hawaiian Pacific Islander, you cannot afford to live in Portland by and large. And I feel like this brings us full circle, because if at the end of the day, the outcome is the same and it is still, the conception still manifests as a racist white utopia, can we really say that things have changed? And what I want to just kind of leave y'all with before we go into question and answer is just recognizing, I know a lot of times I share this information and then folks say, well, what can we do? And I think it's important, that old adage, you don't have to do everything, but you got to do something. And that there are as many entry points to helping to change the future of this place that we live, and to institute real justice, which is racial justice, because you cannot have justice without racial justice. As we learned from the creation of this place, the idea of trying to create a racist white utopia is inherently racist, obviously. And so there are so many organizations that are operating right now. There are also so many Black folks who have been doing thinking and organizing, who have been putting out reports, who have been putting out policy priorities for decades. And so it's incredibly important, especially for white folks, when you come to this work, to recognize that Black people and other communities of color do not need saviors. We need allies and accomplices. And if you are entering into this, then you need to be looking for the leadership and the work that folks have been putting in, again, for decades. And so I strongly recommend, if folks do want a starting place, to look at two different reports, which you can download for free online. The first is the State of Black Oregon report, which is put out by the Urban League of Portland. The last time the full report was put out in 2015, but there have been updates. This report you can download as a PDF. It's got dozens of different racial disparities and areas that it looks at, but it also highlights community organizations, initiatives, resistance, policy changes, there's a wealth of resources available in the State of Black Oregon report. And then the other piece I wanted to highlight is the organization Imagine Black, which used to be known as the Portland African American Leadership Forum, but they've changed their name now to Imagine Black, their People's Plan. And so the process for this was incredible. Folks came together and held visioning sessions in the Black community for years and engaged hundreds of Black folks. And they came out with a report, and I just pulled out the housing section so you can kind of see what it looks like, that lists different priorities, includes quotes from those visioning sessions, but then creates a list of actions and advocacy, lists current projects as well as emerging ideas. And so again, I strongly encourage folks to engage with that and to just engage with the work and the wisdom that folks have been holding for decades, and to look to that to see how you find when and where you enter into this work that has already been happening. So thank you all so much. And I want to create space to open it up for questions and comments and thoughts. So thank you all.
Thank you, Walidah. I hope that we all take time to reflect on that legacy that Walidah talked about, and to realize that this state's history is Black history, and Black history is Oregon's history. And I hope that we can open up a conversation to address some of the issues that Walidah mentioned. I'm actually, I have to apologize. I'm just a little bit out of it after hearing that, and I've heard this presentation many times before. So I have to regroup here a bit. I guess I would like to start while we're waiting for folks to pose their questions and comments. You talk about Black institutions serving as the point of resistance, and I'm reminded of Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s newest documentary about the Black church. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the role the Black church played in Portland and in Oregon as far as creating that resistance and creating that role.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as you said, like everywhere, the Black church has played an important and vital role in resistance, often because it was one of the, places, I mean, during enslavement, it was one of the places Black folks could gather, and also even post-enslavement during Reconstruction era and afterwards during Jim Crow segregation, it was one of the few places Black folks could gather that would not draw the ire or suspicion of white folks. And, here in Portland, it was incredibly important. In that early time period, in the early 20th century, the 1900s, there was actually a hotel in downtown Portland called the Golden West Hotel. And it was founded to house the Black folks who worked on the railroads, because again, Portland being the most segregated city outside of the north of the Mason-Dixon line, was closed to Black people. They couldn't find hotel rooms. And so the Golden West Hotel started. And so there was actually one person who said the only time you saw Black people in Portland was at the Golden West Hotel and at church. That was it during the 1900s, the 19-teens in Portland. So it was an incredibly important gathering space. It was a place where you could go in Portland when you were part of such small numbers, where you could gather in mass and get support. And it has continued that role. And there are many churches that have been involved in these movements over the years in Portland and in Oregon, from the civil rights movement work around police violence in Portland has always been intricately linked to the Albina Ministerial Alliance's Coalition for Police Reform and Justice, which has been working around police violence for decades, sort of being led and pulling together a coalition of both, religious and secular organizations. So that role has definitely been very present here.
Mm-hmm. Another institution that I think of is the Black Press, and I am hoping that we can mention Beatrice Morrow Kennedy. Can you talk a little bit about her and the role she played?
Yes, I have a slide about her. I was like, I was going to put in my Golden West slide and Beatrice Kennedy. I was like, it's too long, Leah. It's too long. So, but they are in the YouTube video if folks want to watch it. But yes, Beatrice Kennedy was amazing. Just an incredible organizer. She founded the Portland NAACP chapter and was one of those folks leading the work around banning birth of a nation. She was instrumental in repealing the Black Exclusion Law in 1926. So NAACP and other Black community organizations repealed the Black Exclusion Law, but the language for the Black Exclusion Law was left in the Constitution, which is not usually how that happens. If you repeal a law, you usually remove the language as well. But that language was left to send a message, as I said earlier. But Beatrice Kennedy was also the editor, the founder and the editor of The Advocate, which was the Black press. And there's actually, there are numerous Black newspapers that existed across Oregon. And there's a library archive of them as well that folks can access. I know through Multnomah County Library, do y'all have access to through Forest Grove Library? Do you know?
That's a good question. I'll check. I don't believe we do.
Okay.
But let me check. I'll look into that. Yeah.
It's amazing. So there were dozens of newspapers. There are still newspapers to this day, like The Scanner and others that are still very much operating here. But these go back to the 19-teens and the 1920s, and it's incredible. Those newspapers are so vital because what they do again is center in Black people and Black life and Black resistance rather than center in the oppression that we've suffered and seeing us as passive victims. It shows the ways that even under the most hostile and brutal of circumstances, Black folks not only created communities that nurtured them, they actually changed Portland and Oregon again and again and again through their courageous organizing. And it's incredible to see that in practice in the pages of those newspapers.
Mm-hmm. I also, just to mention Beatrice Kennedy again, she played a huge role in spotlighting the activity of the Klan as well. So we're getting a couple of questions, and I want to make sure that we get those in. Someone had asked about the lash law, and I know that this is a question that you probably get asked regularly, that accordingly the lash law was only instituted once or never instituted. I guess the question is, why do we focus on it?
Well, because an entire region of this country told a population that they would be publicly tortured over and over again until they left. And that's, I can't overstate that. And I think I get this a lot. And I think folks who are saying, oh, well, it seems like, the Black Exclusion Law was only used once, and it seems like the lash law was never used. The only people who say that are white people, because other folks of color, and especially Black folks, understand the psychological terror that comes from your government telling you if you do not leave right now, everything you have, everything you own, we will drag you out of your house, we will strip you of your clothes, and we will publicly torture you. And then we will do it every 6 months for as long as you stay here. And so, even if the Lash Law was never implemented, it was a method and a tool of white supremacist terrorism. And it was also, again, about inexplicably and unequivocally sending a message to Black people: you are not welcome here. It's like setting up flashing neon signs that shoot bullets at the border and saying, this is what will happen if you come here. And this is, there is no way to talk about Oregon today without talking about this. Because again, I've met a lot of white people in Oregon who are like, this place is wonderful. I wonder why Black people don't come here. This is the foundation of that. And this ideology is built into every institution that shapes our lives. And so again, Black folks came to the West Coast and then they split around Oregon like the Red Sea, because Oregon was very clear. And the Lash Law, I think, is the most brutally explicit way. But policy, practices, ideologies, violence, threat of violence over and over again. I've shown just the tip of the iceberg in this presentation. Oregon reinforcing, you are not welcome here because that is not who we think of. You are not who we think of when we think of ourselves. And Oregon, again, Portland is still the whitest major city in America. So this is not something that is by happenstance. It is not something that just occurred. It's not that Black folks didn't make it out this far. We just got tired and tuckered out around Chicago. None of that is true, right? It's that Oregon has been clear about who it wanted to be since before it was a state, and it has built that into the foundations of all of its institutions. And at this point, institutions just continuing normally is replicating that white supremacist system. And so if folks truly believe in racial justice, then they have to talk about not just tinkering with these systems, but fundamentally changing, reimagining, or dismantling and replacing these systems.
Well, it seems to me that that sort of minimization of an act of terror. I mean that the exclusion law, the Lash Law, is somewhat similar to folks who say, my family didn't have slaves. That was 150 years ago. Not my problem. It is our problem because those systems are still in place. Nothing has changed. And it may be that because those things are less overt, that we don't notice them, but that doesn't make them any less important.
Right. I mean, I don't think they're less overt. I think they've been built so deeply into the systems that we no longer see them, right? It's fish swimming through water. So they're actually incredibly overt. It's that we've all become so acclimatized to it that we're like, well, that's just the way things are. I don't know what you mean. And the sort of psychological acrobatics that white folks specifically go through to not have to acknowledge what is happening very clearly in front of their faces is part and parcel of that, the ways that white supremacy functions and protects and maintains itself. And it unconsciously conscripts white people to be part of its army to protect it. And white folks have to make the decision whether or not they want to be part of that army of white supremacy. And if they do not, then they have to do the work internally and then externally to change themselves and to change these systems. Because again, there's never been a question. Communities of color have been doing that since day one. And again, whenever we do that, we make the world better. And we've made Portland better again and again. Police accountability is better for everyone. The fight that was led by Black communities and other working class brown communities around affordable housing is now primarily benefiting, working class and middle class white people. And so it's incredibly important to recognize that if folks are going to tout advances and tout things about Portland that they think are amazing, many of those things come from the literal blood, sweat, and tears of Black and brown communities. And if you don't acknowledge that, then you are playing a part in minimizing that and allowing systems of oppression to continue.
Mm-hmm. Right. It creates those status quo stories, right? That we don't have to change anything. Everything's, everything is fine. We just don't acknowledge it. Let me see here. I've got a couple of questions from the folks at Pacific, their Office of EDI. What can universities do to have Black studies in predominantly white universities?
Yeah, have one. Do it.
Do it.
I'm like, call me. Well, I work at the Black Studies Department at Portland State. And we're part of the School of Gender, Race, and Nation, which also consists of Chicano Latino studies, Indigenous Nation studies, and women gender sexuality studies. So we're part of a school, but we have our own departments within that. And it's, I think it's incredibly important. And I love that model because it allows us to have the space to talk about the individual experiences of our different communities rather than sort of lumping them all together. Because I think a lot of times when we talk about continually only about people of color without talking about the specifics or the differences, then we lose the nuance of oppression and resistance. But having the School of Gender, Race, and Nation allows us to come together, to see our commonalities, to have shared language and shared framing that makes us all stronger. And so, I think it's incredibly important. And it's also incredibly important for anyone to recognize the history of Black studies. And I have a slide about this as well. I feel like everything we said, I'm like, I have a slide about but, the history of Black studies, the history of ethnic studies is a history of grassroots struggle led by students, by faculty, by staff, and by community. It is not something that the university bequeathed out of justice and concern to folks. It was something folks demanded. It was something that students went on strike for in the 60s and 70s. It was something that they shut down universities to get. They said, we are tired of not having a place to see ourselves reflected in the curriculum, in the framing, in the pedagogy of universities. And they forced the university as a whole everywhere to institute ethnic studies and Black studies and the different departments. And then the university has spent the last decades trying to undo that work. And it is through that connection between community and campus that those departments and those programs continue to exist. So I would just say to anyone at Pacific University or any other university who is wanting to start a Black Studies program or other programs like that, to just recognize this is not something that the university most likely will just give you. It is something that historically folks have had to organize themselves. And, the university may be more open to it given the cultural climate right now, which again has been created by Black courageous struggle. And it's your opportunity to kind of seize the time. But, this is something that you are going to have to conceptualize and work for and maintain. And you're not alone. So I would, really say reach out to other programs in the area. Definitely Black Studies at Portland State is a resource. Reach out to Black Studies departments across the country. This is how we have maintained ourselves. And this is how we have grown and created a space that, not only supports students, but builds that bridge between community and campus as well.
Great, thank you. I look forward to talking to Pacific about that. So,
and you don't have to start and be like, we're starting with a full department. You can build up to that as well. But I think creating that larger vision, and for me, just even beyond this, anytime you have a goal, just start with what you want, not what you think the university will give you. Because the reality is, again and again, we've seen any structure of power does not want to give up any power. And so if we only go by what we're being told is possible, we're only dealing with surface reforms, and we're not getting real change, and we're not getting real power. It is when people demand things that we're being told are impossible that we then create them and build them into existence, and we change everything. And I frame those Black folks who heard the entire region of the Northwest say, you are not welcome here and you'll be tortured until you leave. And they said, well, we're not leaving. I mean, those are courageous sci-fi creators that changed everything. They're the reason I can be here in this place, because they said, you are telling me my existence here is impossible. I'm going to prove to you that it's not. And we're going to prove to you together collectively that it's not. And they did that, and they changed everything. And so I would just encourage anyone looking to create institutional change, do not listen to what institutions tell you is possible. Don't let them tell you, we're going to do a study and we'll get back to you. Build your own goal, build your own vision, and then start figuring out the steps that you need to take to get there. So you can start on step 1, but make sure you know what step 10 or 20 or 50 is, so that you don't get pushed off course.
Mm-hmm. I want to just take a pause and encourage folks while they're providing their comments and questions to think a little bit about what you learned tonight, what has surprised you, what are some of the things that you didn't know that you're going to take from this evening and begin to implement, begin to integrate and to learn more about. I think following along that, we have a question about supporting Black youth in predominantly white schools. How do we do that when they're being bullied and made the targets of racist remarks by coaches, teachers, and their peers?
It's incredibly difficult. And I also think it's important to see the agency of those youth. I'm not sure what age those folks are talking about, but I've been really honored to get to connect with and see the leadership from different Black student unions at high schools across the area. And the youth that I've encountered are just incredible, and they're doing immense work both in their school and in the community. And so, I think it's important to recognize we want to support and protect youth, and also to recognize youth have always been active change makers as well. And so how do we support their leadership if they want to take it and to step into that role? And how do we support the leadership of Black youth that is already in existence? So many of the protests that were happening and that have been happening in Portland and across the nation have been led by Black youth, and holding that space even under immense violence by systems and structures of oppression. And so I think, really thinking about how do we support that leadership? How do we support folks connecting with one another? How do we make sure that they have resources? And I don't just mean money. I mean, information and mentors and support to community organizations. How do we make sure that that youth are being engaged with in this work? But, as an educator myself, I fundamentally think it is imperative for everyone to learn this history. I actually call it a living legacy, because I don't think it's not past at all. I think it's important for everyone to learn this. But I think it's exceptionally important for Black youth to learn this, because otherwise they internalize the racist neoliberal messaging that there's something wrong with them. And I've actually, presented this to high school students on numerous occasions. And I remember one time it was a group of Black youth, and one young man afterwards came up to me and said, before this, I thought I was the problem, but now I realize it's not me, it's Oregon. And I'm like, boom, you got it. I think it's imperative to give youth tools, because Otherwise, everything in their lives, everything in school is telling them they're the problem. There's something wrong with them. They're not represented in the curriculum. Well, your teacher's your authority. They know what's best. Your coach knows what's best. To provide them with this information of both the way that this racism has been institutionalized and the ways that the Black community has always not only resisted, but created immense change, and that they are part of that by just existing, and that they can be more part of it in whatever way they want to be. So as an educator, that's the role I try to support and take on. But again, I think there are so many countless ways to support youth on the day-to-day, as well as to support youth leadership.
We're getting some questions about housing, which is one of the major focuses of your talk. And, I think about Richard Rothstein's Color of Law, where he talks about how this assumption that the barriers to property acquisition and owning a home, we think of as being, accidental, but in fact are the result of federal, state, and local policies that go back decades. We have a question here about, let's see, what are some of the strategies that folks in Portland might enact to offset all of the wealth lost by Black families? And I think connected to that, the idea of lack of access to housing that you talked about.
Yeah. I mean, in the US, the number one way to build wealth, generational wealth, is through owning homes and property. And so, Black folks have historically been locked out of that. And again, it's important to recognize that even when Black folks, against all barriers historically, have been able to scrape together enough money and find a house, and they had to, pay that full price because they couldn't get a, loan from the bank, or, whatever machinations they had to go through. And then they got that house and they were like, yes, I'm doing the American dream. And then the city comes along and under eminent domain takes their house, gives them less than market value, demolishes it, and builds a coliseum or an interstate, or demolishes it for no reason and builds nothing for decades on the land where their home that they scrimped and saved and thought they would pass on to future generations was. So I do think it's important when we talk about, I don't think we can give individual solutions for collective institutional problems. And I think that, again, even when people have the analysis that this is structural, that it is systemic around housing discrimination, it feels like again and again, the response is, well, then how do we get resources to individual Black families to buy their homes, to build wealth? But the reality is, this is a collective problem. And, this structure will not allow enough resources to be flowing into that in that way. And so, one of the things I really love about Imagine Blacks, the People's Plan, is their emergent ideas section. And one of them in the housing section that I shared was around land trusts and housing banks. So how do we collectively as a community, how could we own together, homes or land, apartments, and have spaces where we are not sort of individually being pitted against each other. And there's a great book that goes into a lot more detail about that called What a City is For by Matt Hearn. And it looks at 3 cities, I'm forgetting, Portland, New Orleans, Vancouver, Washington. And he, looks at them and looks at, this idea again of the fact that even when you do get enough money to buy a house in your neighborhood as a Black person, you are then basically, your interests are then diametrically opposed to your neighbor who's renting, right? Because when gentrification happens, it's great for you and it's terrible for them because their rents increase, but your property value goes up. And so how do we break that idea that puts us in conflict with one another? And how do we imagine solutions that exist beyond the sort of reforms that we're told are possible. And so, I'd encourage people to explore those solutions, because I think we don't talk enough about that. And I think we often focus on, well, how do we get resources to individual folks? And I'm not saying it's one or the other. It can be yes and, like, do all of that. But having studied this, I don't see any way that this system will allow enough people to buy their homes, Black people to buy their homes, that we can all, have our individual homes, and that issue is gone. What is going to happen is a few people will get access while entire communities are destroyed, which is what we are seeing in the ongoing process of gentrification.
I'm going to put a link in the chat to a documentary that I just watched recently called Priced Out, which I hope folks will take a look at. It's a really interesting examination of the gentrification in North Portland, and touches on many of the issues that Walidah mentioned earlier, particularly around the Emmanuel building project. Let me take a look. Oh my gosh, look at the time. Again, we could talk all night, couldn't we? I want to just... Well, I've got one more question. I happened to glance down at my bookcase and saw a copy of Sundown Towns. Yeah. And someone had asked about sundown towns. Can you talk about sundown towns in Oregon?
Yes, I almost included that slide. Yeah, and I actually, I was going to, to talk about that, because that book specifically, Sundown Towns by James Loewen, is an amazing book. So I hope folks will read it. He's, one of the main experts around sundown towns. And he also has a great website that he created, which if you Google sundown towns, I think is, one of the top that comes up. It actually, on the website, has an interactive map of the United States that you can click on, and then it'll give a list of the towns, and you can click on those and see the evidence for how it was a sundown town. And so James Loewen has marked at least almost 25 towns in Oregon that were sundown towns. And, again, the reality is Oregon as a whole was a sundown state as well, right? And sundown town is a purposely all-white town that is maintained through laws or through violence. And so James Loewen people talk about sundown laws often, but James Loewen says sundown town is more important because it shows that these all-white communities continue to maintain themselves even after they become illegal through violence or the threat of violence. And he documents sundown towns in this country that are still very much active to this day. It is not something past and gone. It is something that is present tense. I think one of the other pieces that James Loewen talks about that is incredibly important is he says that any time in this nation that you enter into an all-white space, it was created by violence, and it is most likely maintained by violence or the threat of violence. And he says that because we are on indigenous land. So anytime there are not indigenous people there, that is because of violence and the threat of violence. And because communities of color, all communities of color have spread out across this country and have gone different places. And so again, you could find Black people everywhere. And so if there are not Black and brown people there, it is because that was created and in some way is being maintained as a white only space. And I think that that's an important framing because, again, it challenges this sort of white notion of saying, well, I don't know, we're open. People can come, they just don't want to come. That's never the case. There are barriers that are in place, and if you can't see them as a white person, then you should do reading and research because you are unintentionally supporting that. The last thing James Loewen talks about, the biggest sundown towns are the suburbs. And I think that framing is really important because, again, we often have very classist notions of where racism happens in this country, which makes middle class and upper class white people feel better. It's something that lower class white people do. Working class white people are racist. So yes, there might be some town in rural Alabama that is a sundown town. But James Loewen is very clear. The suburbs as an idea were started as all white towns, basically, as all white enclaves to escape the city, to escape the Black and brown folks who are moving into cities. White folks moved to the suburbs, white flight. And so many of those suburbs had in their covenants that Black and brown people could not move there. I've seen many deeds and covenants from places like Lake Oswego that have in the deed Black people are not allowed to be here except as domestic servants. I've seen them that are owned by Black people. So again, Black people who scrimped and saved to be able to afford a house and then have to have a deed, a legal document that says they are not allowed to be there. So, I think that piece is really important because it challenges the idea of where is racism located, and recognizing that when you enter into all white or predominantly white suburbs, that is part of this framework of sundown towns.
Last question. Actually, this would be helpful for me. You gave recommendations for further study and reading, but our viewer wasn't fast enough in writing them down. Is there anywhere that she can go to find those recommendations?
Not specifically online, no, unfortunately. So,
okay.
I think, again, I would strongly encourage folks to look at Bleeding Albina around housing. But if you look, again, my Oregon Black History Timeline video does include some of this information, not all of the resources that I've shared. So that could be a place to kind of go to and jog your memory. So
and
Oregon Black History Timeline.
I've been copying and pasting links with wild abandon. So pretty much everything that Walidah has talked about that has a web presence, you'll find a link to in the comments section on either of the platforms that you're using. So take a look back through those. And I just posted the link to James Loewen's website on sundown towns, and I did post the link to Bleeding Albina. So those are all there as well.
That's how a librarian does. But
I know. I can't fight it.
It's amazing.
No. Well, as I said, I think we could go on all night, but I feel like we have a lot to reflect on, a lot to think about. And I want to, before we leave, I just want to share some of the different groups that I have found to be really helpful in framing this discussion. And Walidah mentioned a couple of them. The Urban League of Portland, their State of Black Oregon is a fantastic document. The Coalition of Communities of Color, Portland United Against Hate, the Portland chapter of the NAACP, Unite Oregon. These are all really great resources. And again, to just reiterate what Walidah talked about, these are organizations that have been doing the work, and these are the voices that we need to lift up and listen to, and to trust. So I encourage you all to take a look at their websites and to look through the reports and other things that they've published as a starting point. And I will try to make these available in the comment section when we're finished. Walidah, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I appreciate you taking the time out to share this important history with us and to provide us with some powerful food for thought and content to reflect on. As you've said, and I think I've said as well, Oregon's history is Black history, and this is a part of our past that we can't ignore anymore. It shouldn't be hidden. It can't be hidden, and I hope that this will be the first step in helping to make sure that it doesn't remain hidden. So again, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us tonight. This video will be available on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel starting tomorrow. So please feel free to go back and watch again and share with family and friends. I'm so pleased that we could make this happen. Walidah, thank you so much for joining us. And to everyone else, be safe. Good night.
Yeah, thank you, Bob, and thanks, everyone.